Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Breachside Broadcast, home of the finest voxcasting either side of the breach. Today's installment follows Misaki as she consolidates her power as Oyabun of the Ten Thunders, and Kaeris as she struggles against Witchling Thralls intent on her destruction, and Parker Barrows as he faces execution at the gallows. I hope you enjoy part 5 of Malifaux Burns, right after this word from our sponsor.
This episode of the Breachside Broadcast is brought to you by the Ten Thunders. The Ten Thunders offers its friendship and protection to all businesses willing to pay fealty to the clan and its Oyabun. Become a client of the Ten Thunders today and ensure the ongoing safety and security of your organization, your friends, your family, and everything you hold dear.
Once, Misaki Katanaka's Bicento had been an inseparable part of its mistress, an organic extension of both her swift arm and her ironclad will. Father had given it to her when she was 7. The polearm was much smaller back then. The bite of its blade had been little more than the wooden nibble of a dulled simulacrum. Disciplined and honed through countless hours of Yamazuko's training, both warrior and the weapon matured together. Whenever Misaki grew, Father would add another few inches to the shaft. When she turned 13, he'd replace the training spade with a proper blade. He could not have known that the same edge would one day cleave his own head from his shoulders. For the first time in Misaki's life, she had gone for weeks without gripping the cool lacquered wood between her once calloused fingers. Now the weapon was propped uselessly against the back wall of her private chambers in the Katanaka trading house. She barely even looked at it anymore. Not since it had been expertly repaired after her encounter with Mei Feng. But for the mischievous glitter of the takamaki inlay along the lacquered haft, it was unobtrusive, like the dying branch of a wizened tree. The Oyabun of the Ten Thunders paid the shimmer less and less notice with each passing day. Lately, Misaki's new responsibilities had deprived her of opportunities to take it to the field. Instead, she pored over ledgers, contracts, and maps. She worked with her lieutenants, carefully orchestrating and commanding the various schemes of her ever-growing syndicate. Her mind was racing, as it had been every day for weeks. Today was no different. She clicked her tongue impatiently while poring over a proposed plan for the assassination of a troublesome MNSU boss. This particular overseer had come dangerously close to discovering Mei Feng's most recent shipment of metal golems to Zhongao. Sloppy, Misaki muttered, her eyes narrowed. A foolish mistake unbecoming of Lady Feng, but an even more foolish solution to rectify it. She snorted and took a sip of her tea, evidently failing to recognize that her favorite blend of jasmine, mulberries, shiso, and honeysuckle had become cold and bitter. 2 hours had already passed since Minako Rei delivered the cup to her office. To Misaki, it felt like mere seconds. Does Hideyoshi really think we can touch this Union rat while he's holed up? She scoffed to herself. Abunai. We should just wait until he visits the honeypot. As if sensing his mistress' impatience, Shang let out a gout of exasperated flame. Recently, the little kitsune, usually bright orange with flickers of rose and topaz, had begun burning a bruised, molten sapphire. His projectiles seemed hotter and hungrier than ever. The familiar voice nearby made Misaki drop her teacup. You should have killed Mei Feng when you had the chance. It was deep, hoarse, and dry as ash. Allowing her to live just so she can continue to support the Empress Dowager imposes troublesome risks. The Oyabun regained her composure. "Hold your tongue," she retorted, although her voice flickered with the faintest hint of uncertainty. She took another sip from the cup. Yuko was correct. Killing Lady Feng would have achieved nothing. I would have lost my eyes and ears in the Arcanist movement, not to mention her considerable metallurgical talents. Keeping her alive maintains control. She shook her head. Anyway, we need those metal golems. Yanlo and Asami can only do so much. Earth doesn't matter anymore, her interlocutor responded. Your destiny, and the destiny of the Thunders, lies in Malifaux. Any efforts to do not advance our interests on this side of the breach are a waste of time and resources. We are not a charity. The voice paused before adding, keeping Mei Feng alive does not indicate control. It just demonstrated how weak you are. Oh? Asked Misaki skeptically. The voice grew even more stern, crackling like embers. You should have made an example of her. You humbled her in front of all her rail workers, and then you wasted a perfect opportunity to sow fear. A bloody, painful execution would have seared a lasting warning in their pathetic little minds. How dare you question your Oyabun? Responded Misaki, fighting to maintain her composure. Think. A Nipponese murdering a champion of Zongo in cold blood. How would that have looked? The hatred between our kingdoms has always frayed cooperation to its utmost limits. Many have rightly pointed out the implausibility of this alliance. I have done the impossible. But the speaker interrupted her with a ruthless chortle. The husky, rasping breaths of grating mirth radiated through Misaki's quarters. Now the entire foundry is more tempted than ever to betray us again. Kang and his laborers think that they are too important to kill. You failed to prove them wrong. Attempting to embrace control has only caused you to lose it. You know this. It's not just about that. I did what was right. I did what was honorable, she hissed. That's more than you could ever say. The speaker ignored her. How long has it been? Mere months. You are already losing your grip, Misaki. First the gremlin betrayed us. Then that fool Lynch almost died from an attack that you did not see coming. And have you not noticed that McCabe seems unusually fond of his new employers? Has he forgotten whom his true benefactors are? And as for Shen Long, well, he always was a bit of a wild stallion, wasn't he? Tell me, how long do you think Asami can withstand the curse that connects her to the Kaiman? She could succumb at any moment. Not this again, Misaki snapped, crumpling up Hideyoshi's assassination proposal and tossing it behind her. I will not doubt my best agents. Never again. Shang spurted out a fresh blaze of blue-tinged flame and roasted the parchment to ashes. Misaki blinked. Had the little spirit's heat always been so intense? Yuko and I have been through this already. Understand? I am at peace. Misaki cut herself off as the sound of 3 knocks reached her ears. Enter, the Oyabun commanded. One of Misaki's senior Torakaji approached with a swift but respectful bow. His porcelain mask was strapped securely to his belt next to his 2 swords, the folds of his saffron garments blossoming around them without a wrinkle. His movements were so graceful that nothing moved out of place as he arched his back and lowered his head. Mistress, are you all right? His brown eyes seemed narrowed in concern. Quite, said Misaki, her lips pursed. What is it, Takeru? The Koritaji paused, his eyes flitting around her office ever so slightly. Misaki could tell that he seemed perplexed, but he was putting up an admirable effort to hide his confusion. It might have fooled someone else, but not Misaki. He reached into his robes and pulled out a stack of stamped papers, Monthly tributes from the other syndicates, mistress. Today was the deadline. And? Misaki cocked her head expectantly, almost eagerly. For the briefest moment, her eyes glanced back to her Bizento for the first time in days. The thin golden crack created by Mei Feng when she'd split the weapon apart was too far away for her to see from her desk. But Misaki knew it was there. None of our subsidiaries are late in their payments. The Jade Hand is still several thousand scrips short, but they have promised to pay double the missing amount next month. I thought this compromise more than satisfactory. If they succeed, we can use the excess to support Yuko's newest recruits. If they fail, the execution of their leadership will send a strong message to the others. Either way, the outcome is favorable. Would you like to see the seals for yourself, mistress? Misaki nodded, catching her expression before her face fell. She forced a smile and extended a becoming hand. Excellent work, Takeru. Ototo will be disappointed, but I am relieved. Dismissed. She collected the papers with a nod. The Tarakage bowed once again, and for the briefest second, the same look of confusion Misaki noticed earlier had returned to his face. He took a deep breath before asking, Mistress, if I may, whom were you just speaking to? He eyed the empty chair across from Misaki's own. Takeru, what are you talking about? Did someone enter your office without our knowledge? As part of your personal guard, I would be mortified if... The Tarakage finally allowed a look of genuine misunderstanding to spread across his pale features. He didn't dare finish the thought. I have had no visitors today, Misaki said with certainty. She took another sip of tea. The cup was already empty. The Tarakage paused, very much wrong-footed. I'm sorry, mistress. It is not my place to inquire, Tarakage said with another bow, before composing himself and closing the door behind him. Misaki thumbed through the new papers, the corners of her mouth moving upwards as her thin fingers ran over the bloody seals of the rival syndicates. Yes, everything was in order. She had control. She just had to keep her focus, that was all. She reached for her teacup again. Suddenly, a burst of brilliant blue flame erupted from Shang's fiery form and obliterated all the papers in her hands to ash. Misaki yelped in shock and looked up. Her teeth gritted in fury as the blaze undulated and coalesced like creeping venom into an all too familiar form. It materialized in the chair directly opposite hers. Father stared back at her from two sightless eyes, his severed head held in his hands. Ash flaked away from the deep cracks in his skin, exposing the muscles formed from ember and burning coals beneath. Daughter. Words dribbled from cracked and molten lips. Just because they can't see me doesn't mean I'm not real. You could never destroy me, Misaki-chan. I will always be with you, a fractured part of you that cannot die. Misaki's eyes widened in fear. The sensation was new. I told you, you mean nothing to me, she spat. Rage filled her. I killed you, and then I obliterated you. I swore to be better. Yuko taught me to be better. I was healing. I am healing. I am in control. No, it crooned. Because I think you've always known. There was nothing to heal from. You were perfect just the way you were. Just the way I made you. Don't you remember what you learned all those years ago? Father's gaze was scorching. Suddenly, Misaki's vision flared, and her office disappeared. A memory that she had suppressed for so long returned. The inside of the storehouse burned. The shards of thirsty glass littered all over the concrete floor were liquefying into blackened, bubbling pools. They smoldered with impossible heat, steam rising as the moist air evaporated with a serpentine hiss. The flames followed Misaki as she ducked and wove. She was different then, younger, faster, more reckless. A flaming angel descended from the broken roof, slamming into the concrete floor with so much force that the ground cracked, scattering shards in a whirlwind of dust. Misaki could tell that this foe wanted her dead. She would not give it the satisfaction. She held her Bizento steady in one hand and raised her other palm against her opponent, bellowing a challenge. A ready pose taught to her by Yamazuko. As she advanced towards her adversary, she placed each footstep with grace and skill, careful to avoid tripping on the charred remains of quartered dervish sword mercenaries as she dodged fireball after fireball. The heat was so intense, but Misaki was persistent. The moment she was close enough, a fiery fist plunged at Misaki's jugular. She brought up her Bizento to block it, eyes squinting to avoid sparks as her blade proved unable to slice through her assailant's molten skin. In an instant, predator became prey. She was on the defensive, her moves falling into a pattern. Block, dodge, strike. Block, dodge, strike. The rhythm was familiar, playing out just as her tutor had taught her. Misaki would turn the hurricane of her enemy's fiery blows into an advantage. She just had to keep this dance going long enough for her opponent to become tired. Then she could close in for a killing stroke. Compared to Misaki's attacks, however, the foe's punches were fierce and uncontrolled. But somehow they remained organic and graceful, like a raging wildfire. It was as though each blow seemed to embrace rather than tame the magical power fueling them. Finally, an opening. Misaki jabbed her Bizento straight into her adversary's neck, but she had seen the strike coming. It was a feint. Misaki's moves were just too predictable. The angels were anything but. The flaming figure rolled away at the last minute and lunged at Misaki. Fiery fists seared her flesh as she kicked off from the ground and hoisted her foe into the air by her arm. Misaki's stomach lurched as they soared higher and higher. 10 feet, 20 feet. She clung onto her Bizento with her free hand, struggling desperately to stab her opponent from below. None of her cuts could connect. Misaki was just too ordered. Control is an illusion. Do you feel it dragging you down, Lady Misaki? The angel asked. This time it spoke in Father's voice. Do you feel it? The angel let go and she began to fall. Down, down, down. Yes, answered Misaki, as her office swam back into focus. It was no longer the angel gripping her, but Father's fiery fingers. A world in chaos, she whispered to herself. Now that you remember, we can begin again, Baojun Katanaka said, his voice dissipating as his body disintegrated into smouldering coals. An ashen palm print lingered on her forearm. Forget what you knew before. Sometimes you have to fall to fly, he echoed. At that moment, Takeru re-entered the room, his face panic-stricken. Mistress, something... The sky is on fire. We must get you to safety. Misaki's back was to him. When she did not respond, Takeru approached her with trepidation. Mistress, did you hear me? The Oyabun nodded and slowly turned around to face him. Takeru gasped. Misaki's smoldering eyes were dancing with flames. Mascara ran down her supple cheeks like wet charcoal, staining her pallid complexion in inky streaks. Black smoke dissipated slowly from her robes, smudging the air around her. The Oyabun clasped the shattered remains of her Bizento in each hand, this time split not by Mei Feng's tiger claws, but by her own knee. Shang let out a feral whelp and snapped angrily at the Torakaji, more fire gushing from his flaring nostrils. Yes, Misaki said, with an unnatural calm, one which barely contained the liberated fury swirling inside her. I heard you. Now please, Takeru, fetch me another cup of tea. I believe my last one is empty. Have you ever been so deep in the water that it squeezes the breath from your lungs, crushing you under its weight? Ramos' words rang through Kaeris' ears as he struggled fruitlessly against the crushing two-handed grip of the Witchling Thrall. She tried with all her might to pry its vice-like fingers off her throat. Her wings flapped maniacally behind her in a futile effort to lift both her and her assailant off the ground. But flight was impossible. The thrall was 3 times her size. The creature sapped away her strength and dampened her magic. She had grown so used to feeling the ether course through her veins that she had almost forgotten what life had been like without it. She felt naked and exposed, utterly unable to breathe. Well, you're doing a hell of a job of drowning. The power is all around you, but rather than swimming in it, you're letting it drag you down. And you keep fiddling with the harness like it's a life preserver. It's not. All that harness does is focus the energy you already command. Without you, it's just a pretty pair of wings. Ramos' face was the last thing she would imagine before her death. But just as her grip slackened and all began to fade to black, Kaeris abruptly felt something inside of her that she'd never experienced before. It was a tiny pulse at first, a barely perceptible reservoir of arcane force whose signature she did not recognize. No sooner had she registered it than the magic grew and grew, expanding within her and blazing hot like a geyser of roiling magma. Within seconds it filled her aching lungs with sweet, warm air before radiating out from her chest and surging through her limbs. You're breathing clean air for the first time in your life. The air you were meant to breathe. Stop fighting it. Now show me how you breathe. The flame wants to burn. Let it. Suddenly, Kaeris could only feel heat. Heat and something else. Freedom. But it was more than freedom. It was the utter demolition of all inhibition. Her pounding heart leapt into her throat as a combination of fear, surprise, and awe washed over her once the power within her swelled. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and there was no flipping it back. The force grew and grew, engulfing her senses. She was so overwhelmed that she did not immediately register how the Witchling Thrall had released her. The beast was bellowing in pain, staring down at the charred flesh of its ruined hands with this unnatural, eyeless sight. The second thrall crept forward, trying to comprehend what had happened to its partner. Very good, girl. Very good. Now let's try something bigger. Kaeris' eyes were now alight with flames so hot that they burned blue. Her skin was scalding like iron. She could practically feel her own sweat evaporating from her body. The mage floated above the ground exactly where the thrall had released her, suspended by magic. A blazing sphere of light and heat blossomed around her like the petals of a smouldering orchid. She screamed, more out of surprise than pain, as the waves of etheric energy reached a roaring crescendo. A moment later, her chest felt lighter than it had in years, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It took Kaeris a moment to process that her harness, the last vestige of her old mentor, had burned away. Brass and steel liquefied into shining rivulets that streamed down her impervious skin, cooling into tiny multicolored ingots on the ground at her feet. The leather straps holding her breastplate caught flame, warped, and then burned. In an instant, Ramos' meticulous handiwork was completely annihilated. Hours and hours of care, testing, and refinement incinerated into nothing. In its place, 2 enormous wings of dancing flames erupted from Kaeris' back, fed further by the impossible energy swirling at her feet. She was reborn. The 2 Witchling Thralls, and several of their smaller stalker brethren, were blasted backwards by a shearing shockwave that even their most potent warding runes could not contain. Although the witchlings were no longer capable of much independent thought, they could still register the terrible majesty of this righteous embodiment of living flame materializing in their midst. Drawn to this inexplicable core of arcane might, yet utterly unable to extinguish it, The witchlings rushed straight at Kaeris, fists and ruined blades raised. Kaeris soared high into the air, arms extended, palms upturned, churning flames dancing at her fingertips. Ash whirled around her as she cast one final look of contempt before her wrath bubbled over and the flaming angel unleashed hell. Burn! A jet of searing, white-hot fire burst from both of her palms. Kaeris spun through the air and guided her hands with methodical precision, inscribing a perfect, blazing circle of concentrated flame onto the ground below. She cut an explosive swath through her foes, keeping her aim steady, and she felt the heat pulse through her with a relentless beat. The smaller witchlings collapsed under the weight of her molten fireballs like wheat before a scythe, their ragged hoods shriveling up and combusting as their diminutive forms were all but burned to a crisp. The larger thralls were still standing, although only just. The first jumped upwards and tried to grab Kaeris by her ankle, but had shied away from the incredible heat emanating from her skin. The second was a little smarter. It reached for a piece of rubble and lobbed it straight at her. As if of its own accord, Kaeris' right wing wrapped itself almost protectively over her body with shocking speed. The projectile was incinerated the instant it collided with her pinion. When the thrall reached down to grab another missile, Kaeris seized her opening. She swooped low and dive-bombed her two adversaries, ramming each of her immolated hands straight into their meaty oafish chests. Where she touched, blackened flesh smoked and sizzled, imprinted with the marks left by her fingers as if struck by a brand. Then Kaeris harnessed all of her remaining power. With a roar, she transferred the very flames that she felt pumping through her directly into the thralls. It was over in seconds. Both of her assailants had been reduced to smoking husks, burned completely from the inside out. Their charred faces, although now blackened almost beyond recognition, were still discernibly transmogrified into an unmistakable expression of agonized astonishment. "Anna," murmured Ironsides, standing in awe as she watched Kaeris land neatly in front of her. Her return to the pavement had been so soft that the click of her ironclad boots was almost imperceptible. The head of the Union felt the sheer heat radiating from Kaeris' angelic form. The blaze of her wings forced her to shield her sweating face with her arm. Ash was still raining down from the heavens. It started to collect in the scorched sockets where the thrall's eyes used to be. "Beautiful," was all Elijah Borgman could stammer as he kissed the wicker figs clasped tightly between his sooty fingers. The painful crash reassured Parker that he had not died. Just a second earlier, he'd felt the rope wrapped around his neck slacken ever so slightly. Then the sinking feeling in his stomach reversed, and in the blink of an eye, the sight of Birmingham's sneering, masked visage vanished before the hard ground came rushing up to meet him. The bandit hit the dirt in a crumpled, sputtering heap. His neck was rubbed raw, and his legs felt weak. He rolled over, gasping at the surge of sweet air now racing through his ruined lungs. He wanted to retch. Looking up, his streaming eyes went wide. The heavens above were cracked and bleeding, leaking clots of ash and gobbets of flame. Fire rained down from a sky torn asunder, scorching everything it touched. Some of the corpses swinging from the great hanging tree caught fire. For others, the ropes binding them to the cursed boughs had been burned clean through, sending them plummeting to the earth too. The largest of the ethereal projectiles exploded on impact, charring everything it touched in dark red spots. Still processing the mayhem, Parker stared in disbelief at the sooty strands of rope tied around his own neck, and then at the platform, which had been demolished by a particularly large fireball into a smoking ruin. The crowd was scattering. People screamed, covered their heads and winced in pain at the sting of the embers falling against their bare skin. Even the hanging tree itself was alight, its sturdy branches engulfed in flames. But the aged tree seemed to be defending itself. Although the ropes around the thick branches were reduced to cinders, the bark itself seemed to glow with arcane energy whenever it had been struck, healing the wounds and smothering the embers. Parker was forced to tear his gaze away from this miraculous sight when, in the corner of his still swimming vision, he registered swift movement from the rubble of the stockade. Both Birmingham and his pet executioner had survived, though the lawyer seemed badly wounded by falling debris. He struggled to lift himself up from the ground. He had to use his lumbering companion as a crutch. Throwing his smoking wig away, he pointed at Parker and screeched, "What are you waiting for, you idiot? Don't just stand there. Kill him." The executioner complied, and without a second thought, he strode purposefully towards Parker, claws extended. Left unceremoniously behind, Birmingham fell back to the ground with a squeal of surprise and a gasp of pain. The executioner was a big brute of a man, whose lopsided mouth was contorted into a resigned grimace of yellowing teeth. He did not allow the floating ash or the prick of the embers on his leathery skin to deter him from performing his duty. Parker braced himself as death approached him for a second time that afternoon. This duel was not pistols at high noon, when two equally equipped foes stared each other down, and only the gunslinger with the quickest, most accurate, and most elegant draw would win fair and square. This was a dirty, wretched tussle for survival that went against every grain of Parker's code. His hands were tied. He had no weapon. Crooked as a bayou fence. So be it. Parker snarled in fury as he ducked the executioner's first blow and rolled away from the second, escaping disembowelment by mere inches. The dive brought him to his opponent's blind side. Parker seized the advantage and then ducked low to the ground. As the executioner turned around to take another vicious swipe, the bandit threw out his bound, cupped hands and lobbed two fistfuls of dirt and ash right into his eyes. Momentarily blinded, Parker's adversary began swiping in the air while rubbing his eyes with his forearm. Acting more on animalistic instinct than strategy, Parker leapt behind his opponent once again and scrabbled for a large stone. Before the executioner could turn around, the bandit marshaled his remaining strength and brought the rock down as hard as he could on his enemy's skull. The giant man fell to his knees, as blood sprayed across Parker's face and into his eyes and his mouth. Blinking back crimson tears, spitting out red saliva, and groaning with exhaustion more than pain, Parker struck again, as the executioner tried to rise. It took several more messy blows before he finally went limp, the remains of his face nearly unrecognizable. "Like you said, just another day," Parker mouthed in manic exhaustion, as he used the blades of the dead man's gauntlets to cut through his fetters. He relished the pain in his wrists as his blood began to recirculate. With his limbs free at last, he approached Birmingham. He was trying to inch away while nursing a clearly broken leg. The mob had scattered, leaving the two of them alone at the foot of the great hanging tree, ash and embers still choking the air. Birmingham was panting with effort to shift his own dead weight. The lawyer was in great pain. His mask had fallen off, revealing a pale, gaunt face screwed up in discomfort. Parker almost stepped back in revulsion. The skin around his eyes was beginning to turn an unnatural shade of dark purple, like the color of a fresh bruise. His once prominent features, including what had formerly been an aquiline nose and a high brow, seemed to have somehow shrunk, as if the lawyer had run into a brick wall. "Was it worth it?" Parker asked, voice hot like steam. "The devil's deal with that Madison fellow?" The man began to sputter and babble, but Parker did not listen. "You ain't even worth a bullet. So tell me, what'll it be? The rock or the rope?" he asked, flexing the remnants of his noose with a menacing snap. Parker was seething with anger. He felt his blood running hot, like someone had lit a fire inside every vein. The lawyer was silent as fear struck him dumb. He wanted to kill this sniveling wretch. All right, my choice then. Not like he gave me one. But as Parker bent down to finish the job, an even deeper feeling that he could not properly articulate stayed his hand. He looked up at the sky, still raining down its fiery payload. He knew that it was not just luck that had saved his life. It was something else, something high, high above. Between the scattered clouds, he thought he could make out a faint silhouette. It almost looked like a man with splayed arms and legs. But then again, he could not be sure. He stared at the figure in the sky. Parker Barrows felt his thoughts slowly extinguish, like candles being snuffed out with calloused fingers, until all that was left was a need for vengeance. But the flames illuminated more questions. Where was his gang? Where was Zip and the infamy? What had caused this fire to rain down from the sky and save him from the hangman's necklace? More than vengeance, Parker needed answers. He knelt down to eye level with Birmingham. The lawyer was broken and mewling in the dust. When the bandit spoke, a cloud of cinders and ash left his mouth and filled the air between freed man and bureaucratic killer. You're a lucky bastard, the bandit admitted to Birmingham. Don't got the time to hurt you like I want to. Parker Barrows listened to the fire above, urging him to pick up a rifle from one of the spectators that lay nearby. It only had a few shots loaded, but Parker only needed one. The bandit watched the smoke float hazily from the end of the barrel, before turning on his heel and striding away. He loosened the remaining segment of the ash-coated rope hanging around his neck. He felt its weight on his fingertips and grunted. After untying the noose properly, he refashioned it into a lasso and expertly slung it over his shoulder. For Parker Barrows, a dead man walking, today was not a good day to die. But it was one hell of a day to live.
That's it for another episode of the Breachside Broadcast. Join us next time for the continuation of Malifaux Burns.